HDR, or high dynamic range images, are achieved by taking the same shot, preferably on a tripod, at different exposure settings. The iPhone 4 actually has the ability to capture HDR inside the camera, and I have two sample shots here. This one has HDR on, the high dynamic range, and this one is just the standard setting. Do you notice the brightness shift here? With HDR on, I'm capturing much better skin tones and a lot more highlight detail. HDR is great for low light situations. In fact, if I hit Command tilde or on the PC Alt Tab, I can toggle the two active windows and really see the difference in HDR versus no HDR. Or you could choose Window, Arrange, 2 up vertical to see these side by side and really compare the skin tones, for example, and see how there's noise in the shadow area where it looks a bit cleaner on this shot. But let's take a look at a higher end series of shots. So I'll close these two and I'll choose File, Browse in Bridge. With images, if I click Preview, that are taken at several different exposures. On this fence image, the exposure was changed so the image got progressively lighter. And you'll notice the background is actually moving a bit. This may not have had a tripod on it. I'm just using my arrow keys to navigate. If I go to Metadata and you scroll down until you reach the camera data, you could see the exposure setting. 2000 here, 1250 for the next one, 800, 500, 320, all the way down to the lightest one at 80. I'm on fence 8 and I can hold down Shift and click on the first shot and choose Tools, Photoshop, Merge into HDR Pro. Photoshop has had the ability to merge high dynamic range images for quite some time. And it's warning you, if you have the original camera raw shots, those are the best to use to keep dynamic range. I don't have them, so I'll just click OK. And what it's doing is stitching together all of these 8 shots, pulling out the best highlight detail, the best shadow detail, and even aligning the shots. And here we are. You may notice in the exposures I'm getting a little bit of ghosting where the fence is, and I can in fact uncheck individual exposures to see how they affect the overall image. So I just turned off the lightest exposure, which actually made the ghost here of the fence that changed positions in the shot disappear. I could try turning off one of the darker exposures, and there's a little progress bar down here that redraws. So depending on which ones you choose, you may or may not see a difference. Often HDR images have a bit of a surrealistic look. The colors might look oversaturated and a little bit pastel. This just happens to be a shot that doesn't have a lot of rich or oversaturated colors. There's clouds, so the sky is fairly dull, and then in the grass it's not an overly rich green. The orange is showing a little bit in this post, but there's not a lot to pull out. Up at the top right, I even have presets, and often HDR is used for building shots where you may want to capture a lit sign or a lamppost that's in the dark. So you could take several exposures and get the best detail around the edges of the lamppost while still capturing good light. So if you had a shot at city twilight, you could choose that, and I could see how those presets affect this. It actually does a very cool surrealistic look for the grass, but it blows out the sky detail. You could try a few of the others like high contrast photorealistic or low contrast photorealistic, or oversaturated. I say oversaturated, just saturated. This is more typical of HDR images, where everything is boosted and richer. And in fact, I think I'm going to leave that. You can also feel free to experiment with gamma, exposure, and detail. But the last thing I'll do is a feature added in CS5. I'll click Remove Ghosts. And when I turn on Remove Ghosts, it will evaluate any haloing or any objects that weren't perfectly aligned and wipe them out. And all I do when I'm finished is click OK, and I've got a final image with the best highlight, the best shadow, detail merged into one final piece, giving me a far better result than I can capture on a single exposure. So I hope you've enjoyed this tour of HDR or high dynamic range. You do not need a high-end camera to capture these, but you do need a camera that allows you to adjust the exposure settings to get darker and lighter shots of the same image.